Here's Hoping, written and read by Jake LaFrance. This is what my life has been reduced to? I sat in a chair at the back corner of the bookstore, where the shelves of fantasy books ended. I held my copy of George R. R. Martin's A Clash of Kings in both of my hands. The large amount of pages made it uncomfortable for me to hold in just one hand. I've got nothing better to do at 2 p.m. than sit in a damn bookstore and distract myself with a book. I sighed and shut my book. I bent down and placed it on the carpet floor while picking up my coffee. A few warm sips later, I placed my drink back down where it made a wet ring and picked my book back up. Inside, on the first page, were my initials, S.W., Stephen Williams. They should really put a damn table here or something one day. I sighed and turned my book to the next chapter. Here's Hoping. I've been coming to the bookstore for the past 3 months for a few hours a day to try and get away from it all. I can't stand being locked up in my motel room when I don't need to be there. I decided that I can't be inside my house anymore. Too many bad memories there. I took up reading fantasy books as a way of escaping from reality. They worked well for me at first. All of the strange names, weird creatures, and bizarre cultures seemed to put me in another world. Even if it was only temporary, it helped ease my stress. But after a while, I sort of realized that while almost everything in a fantasy book was different from the world I knew and lived in, the one thing that remained the same was the human element. No matter what the story was, it always involved humans doing human things and having human emotions. Even non-human characters, elves, goblins, dwarves, had magnified human qualities. I started seeing past the dragons and wizards and castles, and started seeing what it was for real. Once I uncovered the mask, it was hard to put it back on and forget about it. Nevertheless, I drive to the bookstore every day and sit in my spot and attempt to escape off into whatever world or realm the book I bought had to offer. Out of all the things in my life, money is probably the least stressful aspect. I have a little over 9 big ones in my bank account. 9 million, that is. And with no major spending in the near future, I planned on simply writing on that for the rest of my life. All I needed the money for anyway was the nightly rate at my cheap-ass motel, food and drinks, and of course, my weekly book from this damn bookstore. I wasn't any good at math, but it didn't take a genius to figure out that I could keep it going for as long as I was willing to. Money isn't the sort of stress for me now, but money had been the source of conflict for me and my family. Money doesn't ruin everything, it just complicates it. I was actually planning on becoming a marine biologist. I didn't know for certain whether it was what I wanted to be or not, but I was good at it and decided that it was better than nothing. I thought for the longest time that I was going to be a writer. In high school, I loved to read the classics. The Scarlet Letter was my personal favorite. I also wrote poetry and short stories as often as I could. I had plans for novels, but I knew that I wasn't very good at my craft. So I decided to take the safer route and go to college and get what my dad referred to as a real job. To be honest, though, I wasn't the biggest fan of my dad. But what he lacked in fatherly love, he made up for in brutal honesty. He told me that I just wasn't cut out to be a writer. Despite not always enjoying his advice, I always admired that he was willing to tell me. I was in my senior year and decided to do something that I had never done before. Play the lottery. It was only $5, so I figured I would give it a try. I hoped that I could at least double my money, but I knew the very best I could expect would probably be getting my money back and breaking even. But when I looked down at my lottery ticket that day, I realized I had won the jackpot. A grand total of $95 million. I nearly fainted. At that moment, I couldn't predict how much my life would change, for the better and for the worse. After mulling it over with my family and my girlfriend of 2 years, I decided to drop out of college and forget about my career in marine biology. Despite what my dad told me, I wanted to be a writer. I craved for it. In fact, deep down, I felt that I needed it. Writing made me happy like almost nothing could. It's amazing the risks you'll take if money isn't an issue. My girlfriend at the time, Natalie, told me that I was being lazy and that I just didn't want to have to actually work for a living. However, she didn't reject the outrageously large diamond I put on her finger and didn't seem to have a problem with the new mansion I surprised her with in San Diego. Life was pretty luxurious for the both of us. The house, as well as Natalie, were beautiful creations to behold. I can honestly say, however, that at a certain point, I stopped caring about both of them. I was fixated on my writing. At the beginning, I was pumping out 2 poems and a short story every week. They weren't all good, but they weren't all bad either, at least in my opinion. I had all the time in the world to write my stories, and enough money to distract my wife with expensive gifts. Looking back, I can tell that writing was the only important thing in my life at the time. All I want in life is more time to read and write. I just need more time. I wrote that haiku when I couldn't come up with an ending to my detective story, Menace in Mongolia. Why did I write that I needed more time? I didn't do anything else all day but write. I didn't watch television. I didn't go outside. Hell, I barely left my room where I did all of my writing. I must have believed that my ideas would just keep coming to me, and that I couldn't find the time to write all of them in my one measly lifetime. I couldn't have been more wrong. I started running out of ideas within the first 6 months of moving to San Diego, and the short stories and poems I did end up finishing never got published. For the most part, this wasn't a surprise to me, or Natalie for that matter, but I still felt that some of my work had redeeming qualities. The Ceiling Fan I thought for sure would be published. It was a 10,000-word short story involving a guy who gets his face mangled up by a falling ceiling fan, and his struggle with life after the accident. That one I really worked hard on and spent extra time getting everything just right. Looking back now, I don't think it was very good. But it didn't really matter if they weren't being published. I still enjoyed the writing itself and attempting to come up with new ideas. Plus, Natalie and I had enough money to last us 10, maybe 20 lifetimes. The problem was Natalie, or rather Natalie and I, and the fact that we knew we didn't love each other. We were just using each other. She liked the money in the house, and I liked not feeling alone when I went to bed every night. Oh, we might have loved each other during college when we would help each other study, watch TV at each other's dorms, went to the movies on the weekends. We were with each other because we wanted to be. And when the damn lottery ticket changed the scope of my life, it changed the dynamic of our relationship. It was almost some sort of weird mutual agreement that we had to be together. Our divorce was mutually agreed as well. Natalie ended up getting the mansion and half of the lottery winnings I had left. I'm just glad that we never had kids together. That would have been way too complicated. Luckily for me, I was never able to knock her up. To be honest, I wasn't mad about losing either the mansion or my other half of the money. The mansion I disliked from the beginning, except of course my office where I did all of my writing. I grew up in a small 1-story house in North Carolina. I never got used to how big the mansion actually was and how many rooms we never used. That's why after the divorce, I moved into a nice little suburb, still in San Diego, and bought a decent-sized 2-story house. It still had extra room that I wasn't going to use at the time, but I was hoping that one day I could actually raise a family there, so it didn't bother me. As for the money, I didn't care about it either because I didn't earn it. I mean, I did pay $5 for it, and I guess it took me a few seconds to scratch it with the quarter. But honestly, what the hell was I going to do with all the money anyway? Surprisingly, it was actually sort of a relief. And for some strange reason, a part of me still wanted Natalie to be happy. And plus, when you're talking about millions of dollars, a lot divided by 2 still comes out as a lot. With Natalie and the mansion out of my life for good, and my moving in complete, I was ready to get a fresh start on my writing career. Or so I thought. In reality, I needed a break. I was writing constantly every day for almost a year, and the stress of going through with the divorce, even though it was for the best, seemed to be eating away at me. I needed to take time to do the other thing that gave me pleasure in life: reading. I used to read every single day in high school, but in college I just didn't have the time. I was too busy with school, and when I wasn't busy with school, I was too busy spending time with Natalie. Now that I look back on it, I didn't read a single book after I won the lottery and got married. I heard from somewhere that if you wanted to be a good writer, you had to have the time to read. It was like someone who wasn't an avid movie watcher who was trying to become a movie director. How could you make the next Godfather if you haven't seen the actual movie? And how could I write the next Pride and Prejudice if I hadn't read it yet? Well, I went to the bookstore and bought a copy of Pride and Prejudice, along with an assortment of other classic novels, with the hope of reading them all in a week or so. I thought that by reading them, I could be inspired and that an idea would just pop into my head one day, and that I would get right back on track with my writing. The books were, for the most part, great reads. They were short books, most of them around 200 pages, which I could zip through in half a day. Nowadays, people binge watch seasons of their favorite TV shows in a few days. Well, I was sort of binge reading these books. About a week removed from moving in and buying my books, I must have read at least a dozen or so novels, including my high school sweetheart, The Scarlet Letter. I couldn't quite grasp an idea for a short story, however, which was disappointing, but I felt relieved that I got some much-needed reading done. One day, while in the middle of reading Wuthering Heights, I heard the doorbell ring and wondered who on earth it could be. My mind immediately jumped to an image of Natalie holding a newborn baby in her arms, and I shuddered. I eventually mustered up enough courage to go answer the door. If the lottery ticket was the first turning point in my life, answering the door was the second. The person at my doorstep was a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s, holding a basket of fruit. "Hi," she said. "I'm April. I live next door. I brought you a housewarming gift." She handed the fruit over, and I gladly took it. I reached out to shake her hand and said, "Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Steven." "Sorry I didn't get to meet you earlier," April said. "My daughter and I were on vacation the past week. We must have left the day before you got here. Where did you move from?" "Oh, I actually live not too far from here, only in a much bigger place." "Divorce?" she asked. "How'd you know?" I asked. "Just a feeling," she said. "And you're still wearing the ring." I looked down on my left hand and saw that it was indeed still there. I never thought about having to take it off. "It took me a while to remember to take it off as well," she said. "I guess over time it just feels like a part of your body." "You're divorced as well?" I asked. 3 years, she said. "We had our issues and—" She paused. "Let's just say he didn't want anything to do with me or little Grace. Good riddance for all I care." "Would you like to come in and sit down?" I asked. I haven't had company over yet, and I forgot how nice it is to actually talk to people. "Of course," she said, with a smile. "Let me just go get Grace. I shouldn't leave her in the house all by herself for too long anyway." April walked down the front steps and walked to her house, which was on the left side of my house. I stood by my front door and waited patiently for them to arrive. I was thinking to myself that those had to be the two most beautiful names, April and Grace. Natalie was a nice name as well, but not as nice as those two, in my opinion. April and her little daughter Grace, who was a mere 7-year-old at the time, walked through my front door and we sat down in the living room. I explained my story of winning the lottery and getting married and moving into a nice mansion right down the road. I also explained about my dropping out of college and my struggle of trying to become a writer. I didn't want to, but I told them about Natalie and the divorce. April said that she was sorry that it didn't work out with Natalie, but told me to be grateful that it ended on somewhat good terms because her divorce was much more complicated and stressful. I didn't want to ask her about it, as I had a feeling it had something to do with an abusive husband. She also told me that she admired my passion for writing and that I had the courage to go for it. This lifted my spirits up because all I ever heard from my parents and Natalie was that it was a huge mistake and that I was throwing away my potential. Potential for what? Marine biology? I mean, I was good at it, but looking back, What the hell was I thinking? Right then, at that very moment, talking to April, I was reassured that I had made the right decision. And at that very moment, an idea for a novel popped into my head. I told them to excuse me for a moment, and I rushed into my office in the other room and wrote down a quick gist of my idea. I could hear Grace asking her mom what I was doing. She told her that I probably just got an idea for a story, and boy did I ever. A little over a year later, my book was published. It was actually an autobiography about my short 25 years of life. I titled it The Life of a Lottery-Winning Loser. That's what I wrote down on my notepad the day April and Grace came over. It was described as an insightful look on the life of a lottery winner, and a troubling tale of love and passion. I can honestly say that nothing in my book was faked. Everything I put in the book actually happened. Some people questioned some aspects, like how the divorce was seemingly mutual. Overall, though, it received mostly positive reviews and sold moderately well. It didn't quite crack the top 10 New York Times bestseller list, but I wasn't complaining. It probably wouldn't have done so well if I didn't make it known that all the profits would go to various charities. I didn't need the money after all, and I was just happy enough knowing that people all across the country were actually reading something that I wrote. The success of my book helped me gain credibility for my short stories. I would send one in for publishing and it would almost immediately be green-lighted. I even got the one I was the proudest of, The Ceiling Fan, published in The Atlantic. I always loved writing just for the sake of doing it, but it feels much better knowing that people are actually reading what I write and seem to be enjoying it. While I was writing the book, April and I started seeing each other occasionally. It was pretty odd, yet somehow pleasant, that we lived right next door to each other. We went to dinner and the movies at first, like Natalie and I had done years ago. On some nights, I would invite her over to my house for a romantic dinner. It was probably strange for whoever April got to babysit little Grace. "So where are you going tonight, Mrs. Denton?" "Oh, just next door." "Huh?" About 4 months after seeing each other and working on my autobiography, I made up my mind about April. I got down on one knee and popped the question. She emphatically said yes. I could honestly say at that point in my life, writing became the third most important thing. The first two were, of course, April and little Grace. We got married about 6 months later. We both agreed on having a small wedding with only our immediate family attending the ceremony. Little Grace, who was now a happy 8-year-old, was the flower girl. We honeymooned at Disneyland and took little Grace and April's parents with us. That might sound like a strange honeymoon arrangement, but it worked out nicely. In the morning and early afternoon, April's parents would take little Grace to go ride the rides, while me and April would have some alone time in our hotel room. Then we would meet up with them in the afternoon and come back to rest in the evening. This continued for the next 10 days we vacationed there. I eventually moved into the house next door with April and little Grace, but I decided not to sell the house I originally planned on living in. I told April that it could be my official workplace where I could do all of my writing and thinking up ideas for future novels. It was just too loud in the house with little Grace running around, and if she had friends over, it would be impossible to think, let alone write anything. April hesitantly agreed, and so my house was where I would walk to every weekday at 10 in the morning and return from at 3 in the afternoon. This went on for 5 blissful years. In that time frame, April continued working as a school nurse. Little Grace, now wanting to be just called Grace, grew nicely into her early teens, and I continued to write and publish my short stories. I couldn't quite come up with an idea for a novel, and of course I couldn't do another autobiography. My life for those 5 years or so was terrific, but would make for an absolutely boring read. One night, I returned to our home from the airport. A week earlier, I had gotten a letter in the mail, and a few of my old friends called me up and told me that our high school was throwing a 10-year high school reunion for our senior class. I was reluctant to go, but April convinced me that it would be a good idea. She told me that I was a pretty famous writer now and that people would want to see me again. I agreed and invited her to come with me, but she said that she didn't yet feel comfortable leaving Grace alone with somebody for that long. She told me that she has never actually gone a day without being with Grace. She was extremely attached and protective of her, understandably. So I could see how flying to North Carolina and leaving her daughter in San Diego would be stressful. I had a great time catching up with old friends and seeing everybody for the first time in 10 years. I was definitely the most recognized person there, although I would have rather just stayed and chatted with my close friends. A few people even brought their own personal copies of The Life of a Lottery-Winning Loser for me to sign for them, which I was more than happy to do. When I arrived home, I got out of the cab, paid the $20, and tipped the driver a Benjamin. I walked towards the front door and noticed something strange. It was a little after 1 in the morning on a Thursday, and I saw that the lights in the house were still on. I didn't know what to think at this point. I walked up the front steps and opened the door, which was unlocked. If the lottery ticket was my first turning point, and opening the door to find April standing there with a basket of fruit was my second, this was my third, and boy was it rough. The first thing I noticed was that the TV was still on in the living room. If I remember correctly, it was a late-night talk show. I walked a few steps up the stairs and called out April's name, and there was no answer. I then called out Grace's, and still no response. My heart was pounding in my chest. I ran into the living room where the TV was still on, as well as the lights. April was face down on the carpet, with a bullet wound in the back of her head. Blood was still flowing, slowly but surely, from the hole onto the carpet, creating a puddle of red and black liquid. I was getting ready to fall on my knees, and then onto April when I realized that Grace wasn't in the room.
"Grace!"
I yell. I found her immediately lying in the kitchen, with a bullet wound, only this time it was on her forehead. Her eyes were still open, and red blood flowed down onto her nose. Nearly half of the white and black tiles were now colored dark red and purple. I got down beside little Grace and grabbed her head with my 2 hands on her bloody cheeks. I screamed so loud and was shaking so incredibly hard that looking back on it now, I'm shocked that I didn't pass out. Someone must have heard my awful cries of pain, because the police arrived about 7 minutes later. When they came through the open door and saw me lying next to my dead wife, they pointed their guns at me and told me to step away and put my hands behind my back. Luckily, after I gradually came back to my senses, I was able to explain to them that I was the husband and stepfather, and that I had been in North Carolina and just got home when I walked in and saw what I saw. My story checked out, and I was free to go after I was asked a bunch of questions, mainly trying to help them find a suspect. I told them that the only person I could think that had a motive could have been April's ex-husband. And wouldn't you know it, they found traces of his DNA in multiple rooms of the house. He was found dead 3 days later in his car, having slit his throat. I guess he must have ran out of bullets. Everyone on both sides of the family were devastated. The funeral was agonizing to go through. It was paid for with the fraction of my lottery winnings. Seeing both of them, a loving wife and mother, only 39 years old, and a wonderful, beautiful 13-year-old girl, lowered down into the earth was enough to send me over the edge. I cried my eyes out and didn't seem to stop for at least a week. I stayed at a motel while the house was being cleaned. I couldn't stay in my other house next door. The wound was still fresh, and the memory was too painful. It's been 3 months since I came to the motel, and I haven't left since, except for, of course, to come to this bookstore and to try to block out the memory of what happened to April and Grace, with castles and dragons and wizards. I don't think I can love again. Actually, that's wrong. I don't want to love again. I don't want to get close to anyone ever again, because I now know how it feels to have them taken away. The more you love something, the harder it is to live without it. How could I love again after what had happened? I put down my book on the floor again and picked up my coffee, which was now cold. I took one bitter sip and put it back down. The wet ring dried but was still noticeable. I picked up my book once more but had trouble finding where I left off. I believe that I have lost all hope. I don't have enough courage to commit suicide, but I wish I did. That's a terrible thing to say, but it's difficult not to feel that way. I don't want to feel hurt anymore. To be honest, I don't really want to feel anything right now. I'm just wasting away my life anyway, reading these damn books, drinking my damn coffee. What am I doing? Excuse me? Asked an unfamiliar voice. I got slightly scared and dropped my book. I looked up and saw a young woman looking over me. She was smiling at first, but then frowned when I looked directly at her, as if she could tell I was upset. Oh no, she exclaimed. I'm so sorry. She bent down and picked up my book and handed it to me. Don't worry about it, I muttered. I hate to bother you, she said, smiling once again. But aren't you Stephen Williams? Yes, I said softly. How do you know my name? Well, she started, I read your book when it came out, and I loved it. And then I saw a few months ago the terrible story on the news. She paused. I'm so sorry for your loss. I sighed and thanked her. It's been a tough couple of months for me, I said. To be honest, I haven't actually talked to anyone since the funeral. That's not good, she said. It's always good to talk things out, especially at a stressful time like this. What do you know? I snapped. I instantly regretted it and apologized to this stranger. She bent down in front of me, so we were at eye level. It's okay, she said. I've gone through a few deaths in my lifetime, trust me. You don't want to bottle it up. I looked into her eyes, and I found what I was looking for. Do you want to sit down with me? I asked, holding back my tears. I just realized that I'm in desperate need of a companion. Of course, she said. I'll go get a chair. She left for a few moments, giving me a little bit of time to wipe the corners of my eyes. She returned quickly with the chair and sat right in front of me. They should really put a table here, don't you think? She asked. I laughed. I couldn't help it. What? She asked enthusiastically. Nothing, I answered. I never got your name. What is it? Brooke, she said. Brooke, I said. What a beautiful name. She blushed and thanked me. Not quite as beautiful as April or Grace, but it was something. I think it may have been too rash. I think now, more than ever, I have the chance of moving on with my life. Because what is hope if not the strength to go forward, even at the toughest of times? But can I ever love again? Will I ever love again? Here's hoping.